Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is presidential duties and re-election prospects. The year is 1850, and the Compromise of 1850 that Fillmore has signed into law really dominated his presidency, but there were other things going on, both domestically and internationally. On the domestic front, the economy did pretty well on Fillmore's watch. Some of it buoyed by the gold rush in California, which was now thriving, brought a lot of hard currency into the American economy. Cotton was booming in the American South. You've got railroads being spread out now across the country, particularly in the North. Samuel Morse's telegraph is also being rolled out across the country, changing communication patterns across the nation. Overall, the federal government was running a surplus, about $4 million a year, so they had some excess cash to be able to start furthering the pay down of the national debt. For Fillmore, he made some trips as President of the United States to meet the people as part of his presidential duties, and probably the most personal and enjoyable trip was the one that went north that included a stop in his hometown of Buffalo. Later on, he made a trip to Virginia, and then he was back up north to other New England states centering on the Boston area. Enjoyed getting out and giving speeches, meeting the people, being part of his presidential duties. His family was always with him, and very close-knit between his wife, Abigail, his two children, Powers and Abby, along with Fillmore. They joined him in the White House. Now, Abigail was ill throughout much of Fillmore's presidency, and so she wasn't able to perform a lot of the traditional duties of the First Lady, a lot of the social and hostess responsibilities. She was still active in the household with the family and some friends in the White House, but not as much with guests and dignitaries, and so those duties fell upon their daughter, Abby, still a teenager, but by all accounts, thrived in this role. His son, Powers, now 22, a Harvard graduate and a lawyer in his own right, he became his father's personal secretary. Again, very much of a close-knit family household in the White House under Millard Fillmore. Fillmore, same work pattern as always. 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, he was a workaholic. Sundays, he took the day off. Nothing changed during his presidency. Foreign affairs, very much a big part of what goes on for American presidents, and no exception for Millard Fillmore, a sort of a hodgepodge of a handful of issues that were on his plate. One of the things he wanted to do was move forward on the deal that his predecessor, Zachary Taylor, had signed with Great Britain to build a canal connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific going across Nicaragua in Central America. So the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was in effect that could have made this go forward, but things put on the brakes almost immediately. As Fillmore was thinking about moving forward, he recognized that Nicaragua was in a military fight with its neighbor Costa Rica, and that was going to make it impractical to build a canal at this time. And in fact, no canal would ever be built in Nicaragua, and it would be another 50 years before Theodore Roosevelt would really push forward with a canal that would go through Panama. Compromise was in the air for Millard Fillmore internationally with the country of Portugal. Now, this was a long-standing dispute about American claims to the tune of around $233,000 that the Americans had had against Portugal dating back to the War of 1812, 4 decades before this. And Fillmore's predecessors were holding out, one after another, fighting to get all of this money. Fillmore said, enough's enough. Let's cut our losses, make a compromise deal. He was willing to take less to get this off the books, and that is what happened in the agreement with Portugal. Now, one of the things that American presidents had to deal with on a sort of an off-and-on basis was the concept of filibustering. Now, when we think of filibusters today, we think about the United States Senate and sort of delaying tactics of trying to keep things from coming to a vote. Well, filibustering, as the term was used in this context, is about having citizens of one country, not military, but private citizens going from one country to go get involved in rebellions in other countries. For example, the United States had people in the United States, individual citizens, who wanted to go help the rebels in Cuba, perhaps foment a rebellion, and they thought this was both their duty and their passion, and unfortunately it was against American law. The United States was neutral when it came to this conflict in Cuba as an official policy of the nation. There was no military involvement, and it was illegal for American citizens to sort of take up on their own and go off and fight in wars in foreign countries. it was very difficult to police, but Fillmore made the statement to Congress that no individuals have a right to hazard the peace of the country as to violate its laws upon vague notions of altering or reforming governments in other states. Again, illegal, he was doing his best to stop it, but there was a group under Narciso Lopez who had a group who was ready to go to Cuba and fight with the Cuban people against the Spanish government, perhaps overthrow it, take over the island nation. And Fillmore eventually was not able to stop it. They got ships, they got guns, they went, and it was a disaster for Lopez and his men. The people did not rise up around them. The Spanish government, or the government of Spain that was in charge, and the Spanish military captured the Lopez and his men. More than 50 were executed on the spot. A bunch of others were sent to Spain under prison and hard labor. Well, Millard Fillmore had no sympathy for these folks, but he did see his responsibility as the U.S. president, and he worked with his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, to eventually secure the release of those prisoners and bring them back to the United States. Looking west for more foreign policy areas, the Sandwich Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that we now know as the Hawaiian Islands had been first recognized by the United States when John Tyler was president. And Tyler went beyond recognition. He took the Monroe Doctrine that had come from James Monroe many years before that basically said, Europe, we'll stay out of Europe, you stay out of the Americas. No more colonies for Europe in either North America or South America. Well, John Tyler took that a step further. The Tyler Doctrine, he put that circle of to keep Europe out to include the Sandwich Islands, right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Well, those islands were becoming even more important now in the 1850s as the steamship, international travel by steamship, was putting a high premium on finding coaling stations, places for these steamships to refuel, and Hawaii was perfectly situated to perform this function. So it was Fillmore of great concern when all of a sudden France was starting to talk about placing a protectorate over these islands, which could make things more difficult for the United States. For Millard Fillmore, he spoke of his desire that those islands should not pass under the control of any other great maritime state, but should remain in an independent condition and be so accessible and useful to the commerce of all nations. Again, working with Secretary of State Daniel Webster and France, they were able to get France to back down. No protectorate was established. Also in the West, Japan. Japan had been essentially a closed society for centuries, but recently they had started to open up a little bit of trade with China and a little bit of trade with the Dutch. Basically, one ship a year was allowed for the trade with the Dutch. And Millard Fillmore was interested in these markets for the United States. It was President Tyler who had opened up the Chinese market with a treaty initially, and now Fillmore was looking to do the same with Japan. He actually decided to send Commodore Matthew Perry and a small fleet, 4 American warships, to go try to seek a treaty with the Japanese. Now, they didn't get off until November of 1852, so this is toward the end of Fillmore's presidency, and they wouldn't come back until March of 1854, but they came back with a deal. It did open ports for trade, an agreement to plan for consulates in both countries. President Franklin Pierce signed all of this into law, but it was all initiated on the watch of Millard Fillmore. So Fillmore was busy in foreign policy during his presidency. His economy was going well, but all of this was clouded and shaded by the Compromise of 1850, the implementation of it, including that odious fugitive slave law that Fillmore continued to prosecute. Election year 1852 rolls around. Question is, would Millard Fillmore even run for president? Now, he had been elected initially as a vice president before elevating to the presidency when his predecessor, Zachary Taylor, died. Would he run for president in his own right for the Whigs in 1852? This was the question. He had doubted his own prospects as early as November of 1850, just a couple of months into his presidency, when he said that, "I believe I am holding the last office that I shall ever hold, and have no desire to prolong it 1 minute beyond the constitutional time." His frame of mind was the Compromise of 1850 was controversial. He had to remain independent of politics because he believed his job was to go implement it. He knew that was going to make people unhappy with him, and he was okay with that if it was good for the country. And so he wasn't really thinking he was going to be electable in 1852. There were others in the mix, and there were talks about who should or who should not get the nomination. Some of those others were his own Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, who really wanted the position. Major General Winfield Scott from the Mexican War. He really wanted the position. And you had party stalwarts like a Henry Clay who opined on these candidacies. Now, Clay was dying. He was the longtime leader of the Whig Party, but he's in his last years, and he believes staying the course with Fillmore was the right answer. According to Clay, the foundation of my preference is that Fillmore had administered the executive government with signal success and ability. He has been tried and found true, faithful, honest, and conscientious. He has been tried in the elevated position he now holds, and I think that prudence and wisdom had better restrain us from making any change without the necessity for it, the existence of which I do not perceive. Now, this isn't all that surprising. They were never really all that close, but Clay's Compromise of 1850 was the statute that Fillmore was actively implementing at this time, so it's not that much of a surprise that Clay would be in favor of him. There was, of course, strong opposition, also not surprisingly, coming from his own state of New York, Thurlow, Weed, William Seward, who had been against Fillmore now for many, many years, and they were strongly against the implementation of the fugitive slave law, so they were pushing for almost anybody except Fillmore. Where did Fillmore stand? Well, he remained basically silent. But his silence was perceived as an endorsement of Daniel Webster. It was in his own cabinet. And so if he was going to run himself, people would think he'd be squashing the interest of people supporting Webster, but he did not do that. And this was kind of the mindset as the Whig convention opened up in Baltimore in June of 1852. Now, this took place a couple of weeks after the Democrats had had their convention. They had trouble finding a candidate and eventually settled on a dark horse, Franklin Pierce. As far as the Whigs were concerned, the South was really, they were for President Fillmore. They liked what he was doing with the Compromise of 1850. Most of the North was for Winfield Scott, except for a pocket in New England that was supporting Daniel Webster. Eventually, this came to the vote, and on the first ballot, it was all Fillmore and Scott. Fillmore, 133 votes. Scott had 131. Webster only had 29. But then there was little movement. Ballot after ballot after ballot. And it was pretty clear that people were just holding on. If Webster's supporters had backed off and given their support to Fillmore, Fillmore would have gone over the top and taken a majority. But they were not willing to back off, in part because Webster was unwilling to back off. Well, they got to the 46th ballot on Saturday and said, enough's enough. Nobody's moving. Let's shut this down and take a break, take the Sunday off, and we'll come back Monday morning. There's a lot of pressure in that time on both Fillmore and Webster to drop out to kind of keep Scott from becoming the nominee. Well, then some really strange thing happened on the Monday morning when the convention is about to come back in order, when Daniel Webster and Millard Fillmore both decided it was time, independently decided, that they were back out in favor of the other one. And it got crosswise in letters. They weren't using Samuel Morse's telegraph at the time for more instantaneous communication. Webster's letter came on this morning, Monday morning, June 21st. My dear sir, to the president, I have sent a communication to Baltimore this morning to have an end put to the pending controversy. I think it most probable that you will be nominated before 10 o'clock, but this is my opinion merely. Well, Fillmore got this note, and now he's confused because he had done essentially the same. He wrote back to Webster, my dear sir, I had intimated to my friends who left last evening and this morning a strong desire to have my name withdrawn, which I presume will be done, unless the knowledge of your communication shall prevent it. I therefore wish to know whether your friends will make known your communication to mine before the balloting commences this morning. If not, I apprehend it may be too late to affect anything. So this was just sort of chaos when these mixed messages were showing up at the convention in Baltimore on this Monday in 1852. So what did those supporters do? A lot of them went to Winfield Scott. Again, a little bit odd, but they kind of thought because the Webster and Fillmore camps couldn't get their act together that Scott was probably going to get the nomination and they didn't want to be left out. And so what did they do? They aligned with Scott, put Scott over the top on the 53rd ballot. This was not unifying, though, for the Whig Party. The Southerners were alienated by Scott. This was not their candidate. This was going to be a very tough race, and sure enough, Scott lost badly in the fall canvass to Franklin Pierce. The last couple of months for Millard Fillmore and his administration, he focused on the beautification of Washington, D.C. He was one of the first presidents to really take this seriously. According to Fillmore, this city stands upon a spot recently selected from the wilderness and consecrated to the exclusive use and control of this great nation and rendered an attractive object of love and admiration to the whole people. It is the emblem of our union and should be the pride of every patriot. Acting upon these views, I have cheerfully lent all my efforts to beautify and adorn it, not merely for the sake of the residents of the city, but as the object of just national pride and as a means of strengthening our glorious union. This former swampland was finally coming together, and Fillmore was really helping out. He approved some legislation that would significantly expand the U.S. Capitol. He presided over the unveiling of a grand statue of Andrew Jackson on a horse in Lafayette Park, right outside the gates of the White House. And he was observing the rise of the Washington Monument that was continuing to be built. It reached a height of 65 feet during his presidency. Other projects on the National Mall, all of which, though, for Millard Fillmore came to an end when he handed power to his successor, Franklin Pierce, in March of 1853. And that is Millard Fillmore, Presidential Duties and Re-election Prospects from the Life of Millard Fillmore. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.